The life of Oscar Micheaux began in 1884 in Illinois, the son of formerly enslaved parents. That same year, Grover Cleveland had just been sworn in as President of the United States. The Emancipation Proclamation was barely 20 years old, and the fragile hope of Reconstruction was fading fast. An economy once run by slavery had reinvented itself under a cruel new name, Jim Crow. Back then, all it took for a black family to escape the chains of Kentucky was to cross this river into Illinois. That's exactly what many did, including Oscar's ancestors. On both sides of his family, they fled the South and eventually settled in Chicago, a city Micheaux would later describe as the freest city in the world, the land of Abraham Lincoln. But just a few counties south, the old ways still held firm. In southern Illinois, lynching was not uncommon. This was where Lincoln's rival, Stephen Douglas, had once secured 75% of the white vote by appealing to Southern sympathies. Whether Micheaux himself ever witnessed such violence is unclear, but his films would later speak volumes about the terrors of racism, both overt and insidious. Oscar's mother, Belle Goff, was born into slavery in 1856 in Graves County, Kentucky. She was the only child of the Goff family, who had settled in Illinois just 1 year after the Civil War. A firm, no-nonsense woman, Belle became Oscar's first guide and influence, passing down stories of Booker T. Washington and the value of hard work. His father, Calvin Micheaux, was fair-skinned, referred to in records with the term mulatto, an offensive and outdated classification for those of mixed race. But light skin offered no real shield. Calvin had also been born into slavery, and by the time he met Belle in Massac County, they were both survivors of America's brutal racial past. At 17, Oscar left for Chicago. He found work as a Pullman porter, one of the few prestigious roles available to black men at the time. It was on the rails, between stops and silence, that he began to write. Themes of race, ambition, betrayal, and resilience poured onto the page. Years later, those stories would leap from books to the screen. But first, he'd leave Chicago behind and take an even greater leap, heading west to South Dakota to become a homesteader. Isolated and surrounded by hardship, it was there far from any Hollywood backlit that Oscar Micheaux found the seed of his first novel and the fire to change American cinema forever. Oscar Micheaux arrived in South Dakota not just chasing land, but a vision. Like many African Americans drawn west by the Homestead Act, he saw opportunity in the vastness of the prairie. But the land was harsh, and so were the times. His marriage to Orlean McCracken, a young, educated black woman from a prominent family, was troubled from the start. Orlean's family, especially her conservative father, viewed Micheaux as unstable and arrogant. He was a dreamer with no fixed income, stubbornly devoted to writing and business over domestic life. Tensions mounted, and the marriage fractured under the weight of poverty, isolation, and conflicting values. Orlean eventually left, and Oscar's time in Dakota darkened. From 1912 to 1914, Micheaux endured what he would later call his dark days. Alone on the plains, buried in debt, and estranged from his wife, he turned inward. Books became both his refuge and his compass. He devoured literature, classics, bestsellers, anything that offered insight or escape. Two works struck him to his core: Jack London's Martin Eden and the autobiography of an ex-colored man by the anonymous James Weldon Johnson. London's semi-autobiographical novel about a working-class writer's bitter rise and tragic fall mirrored Micheaux's own isolation and ambitions. He saw himself in Martin Eden's hunger for success, for love, for meaning. The story's ending, with Eden drowning in despair, haunted him. But it also pushed him. Inspired by Eden's relentless discipline, Micheaux began to write daily. He claimed he wrote 10,000 words the first day. This was the beginning of The Homesteader, a novel born from heartbreak, labor, and a razor-sharp understanding of the gap between American ideals and black reality. By late 1912, news of his work reached the local Dallas News, who celebrated the idea of a black man writing the story of the Rosebud Country. "Oscar, accept our congratulations," they wrote. "We know your story will be interesting. But a book wasn't enough. Micheaux didn't just want to tell stories. He wanted control over how they were told. When white-owned publishing houses hesitated to back him, he did what no one expected. He self-published. Then, in an even bolder move, he adapted the Homesteader into a film himself. He formed the Micheaux Film and Book Company, becoming not just a novelist, but a producer, director, and distributor. This was nearly unheard of for any filmmaker in the early 1900s, let alone a black man. But Micheaux wasn't interested in permission. He was building something no one else would. His own cinematic nation. By 1917, Micheaux had turned personal heartbreak and prairie hardship into his first full-length novel, The Homesteader. But for Oscar, ink and paper weren't enough. He wanted total control over the narrative. In the same way he had self-published his novel, Micheaux now envisioned a bold, unprecedented leap into film. He saw what Hollywood was doing and what it wasn't. In 1918, he founded the Micheaux Film and Book Company. With no studio backing, no access to the major distribution networks, and few investors, he wrote, produced, directed, and distributed his own films. It was radical. It was unheard of. It was the birth of a new kind of black cinema. But the film bug had bitten long before. As early as 1902, back when he first arrived in Chicago, Micheaux had been attending movie houses, both the grand theaters of the Loop and the humbler venues in the city's Black Belt. By 1904, the South Side had at least a dozen picture shows, mixing vaudeville, blues, and the magic of silent one-reelers. Micheaux was a constant observer, absorbing the mechanics of storytelling and stagecraft, learning not just what made a film captivating, but what made it matter. But what he saw on those screens infuriated him. Black actors, when they were allowed on screen at all, were relegated to caricatures, docile mammies, shuffling darkies, foolish sidekicks, or violent brutes. Donald Bogle would later categorize these as the 5 pillars of early black stereotypes: toms, coons, mulattoes, mammies, and bucks. Micheaux saw these tropes as not only offensive but dangerous, tools of distortion that erased black dignity and experience. Then came the birth of a nation. D.W. Griffith's 1915 epic shocked Micheaux to his core, not because of its cinematic grandeur, but because of its virulent racism. A glorified retelling of the Civil War and Reconstruction through the eyes of the Ku Klux Klan, Griffith's film wasn't just a distortion, it was a weapon. With its white-hooded heroes and black villains, it set a new low for American cinema. To Micheaux, it was a direct attack on everything he knew to be true. He refused to let that vision of America stand unchallenged. And so, he responded the only way he knew how, by creating something better. A cinema that told the truth. That revealed the full humanity of black life. That offered stories with nuance, power, and pride. In 1920, he released Within Our Gates. It was a cinematic thunderclap, a direct rebuttal to D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation. While Griffith glorified the Klan and demonized Reconstruction, Micheaux turned his lens toward the real America, an America of lynchings, racial terror, and northern hypocrisy hiding behind polite society. In one unforgettable sequence, Micheaux showed the brutal lynching of a black family, father, mother, and child by a white mob. It was a scene no other American filmmaker had dared put on screen. He forced audiences to look at what was happening in the shadows of their own country. But Within Our Gates wasn't just a protest, it was a mirror. It examined not just white supremacy, but internal struggles within black communities, colorism, class division, and the dangers of assimilation. Micheaux's films refused to flatter anyone. He challenged white America, but also called out the ways in which black elites distance themselves from their own people. For this, he paid a price. Micheaux's work was constantly under siege from censors, who demanded cuts or banned his films outright. White Hollywood gatekeepers refused him access to their distribution networks. But Oscar didn't fold. He hustled selling tickets door to door, screening films in church basements and barbershops, whatever it took. In an era where black voices were silenced or distorted, Oscar Micheaux didn't ask for permission. He just picked up the camera and told the truth. In 1925, he cast a young stage actor named Paul Robeson in Body and Soul, a haunting, uncompromising film about moral hypocrisy and duality. Robeson, who would go on to become an international icon, delivered a powerhouse performance as both a charismatic preacher and his morally upright twin. It was his very first film role. That same movie also marked the screen debut of Mercedes Gilbert, a poet and playwright-turned-actress, who brought fierce intelligence and presence to every role she touched. For both performers, Micheaux's camera became a platform and a launching pad. In the late 1920s, as Oscar Micheaux was battling censors and hustling to keep his independent studio afloat, a new figure entered his world, one who would become both his creative partner and life companion. Her name was Alice B. Russell. They met during a casting call. Alice was poised, intelligent, and carried herself with quiet command. She wasn't just another aspiring actress. She was a trained performer, and more importantly, she believed in Micheaux's vision. He cast her in his 1928 film The Broken Violin, and from that moment forward, she would appear in several of his works, not just in front of the camera, but increasingly behind it. Their partnership was more than romantic, it was logistical, intellectual, and deeply collaborative. While Oscar pushed storylines and production, Alice handled the company's books, correspondence, and day-to-day operations. She became the unofficial business manager of the Micheaux Film and Book Company, a stabilizing force in a career marked by artistic risk and financial strain. Though they faced the same pressures of any couple trying to run a business together, especially under the constant weight of racism and economic hardship, their bond endured. Alice supported Oscar through triumphs and setbacks. In a world that rarely gave Black women credit, she quietly helped steer the ship of one of the most revolutionary careers in American cinema. By the late 1940s, the world Oscar Micheaux had fought to reshape was beginning to shift again. The race film industry, once a vital space for independent Black voices, was slowly fading. Hollywood was starting to integrate, but on its own terms, and often without the boldness or honesty Micheaux had championed. He continued to write and lecture, still restless, still dreaming. But the money wasn't what it used to be. The studio was gone, the cameras packed away. He was a man who had once made over 40 films, now quietly living out his final days in relative obscurity. In 1951, while on a trip to promote a new book project, Micheaux fell ill. On March 25th, he died of heart failure in a hotel room in Charlotte, North Carolina. No grand send-off. No red carpets. Just a quiet exit for a man who had shouted with his art for decades. He was 67 years old. Oscar Micheaux's body of work was massive, over 44 films spanning both the silent era and the early days of sound. But tragically, most of those films have been lost to time. Improper archiving, decaying film stock, and institutional neglect robbed the world of many of his stories. Only a handful survive today, painstakingly restored by archivists who understand the weight of his legacy. Yet even in fragments, Micheaux's impact is undeniable. He was the pioneer of race films, movies made by and for Black audiences, outside the control of the white-dominated Hollywood system. These were films that spoke directly to Black lives, Black pain, and Black possibility. The ripple of his rebellion can be felt in every Black filmmaker who came after him. Spike Lee, who reshaped American cinema in the 80s and 90s, often pointed to Micheaux as a foundational influence. Without Oscar, there would be no Do the Right Thing, no Moonlight, no Get Out. He was the Jackie Robinson of film, breaking barriers, shouldering criticism, and daring to go first. Though recognition came too late, it did come. Oscar Micheaux was posthumously honored with a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame and celebrated by institutions like the NAACP. But more than plaques and tributes, his real legacy lives on in every bold Black storyteller who refuses to wait for permission. Thanks for watching another Fresh K documentary, where we bring hidden history to light and honor the legends who paved the way. If you learned something new, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. And drop a comment below. What's your favorite Oscar Micheaux film? Or the Black filmmaker who inspires you most? Until next time, one love.
You know I'm on that grind. Voices of the past echo through the years. Cause of the struggles and the triumphs, see the hidden tears. And every line of wisdom flows like a stream. Join me on this journey, let's feel the dreams.
Telling all the stories that you never know.
Yo, drop the gym, legacy file, let it resonate. History and coding, elevate the stake. Black soul, never underestimate. Grinding hard, got the vision crystal clear. Channeling the past, so we persevere.